Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast with Bill Curry, the great Bill Curry, is brought to you by Compassion International, the most trusted child development ministry in the world. For more information about how you can help release a child from poverty, check out the website compassion.com/sportsspectrum. Compassion.com/sportsspectrum, food, education, medical care, vocational training, all done in Jesus' name. You can help make a difference and bring a child in poverty hope. Go to the website, pray about it, and consider it. Consider sponsoring a child today. Before we get to our conversation with Bill Curry, and really excited for you to hear what Bill has to say, I want to tell you about a brand new podcast coming your way Monday, December 16th from the creators of Sports Spectrum, and it is called Football Sunday. Now, this podcast is unique and different from what we do here at Sports Spectrum because this is first-person stories from current and former NFL players sharing their Jesus story, sharing how God has moved profoundly in their lives. The athletes themselves are telling the story. And we launch it on Monday, December 16th, with 3 episodes. Trent Dilfer, Brandon Marshall, and Drew Brees are all appearing on the first 3 episodes of the Football Sunday podcast, telling their story of faith and how God has moved in their lives. I highly recommend that you subscribe. You're going to love this podcast. It's a really quick podcast, 7 to 10 minutes long. It's not very long, so you can bang it out on a couple of commutes here. And it's the athletes themselves, the football players themselves telling the story. Subscribe today everywhere podcasts are found: Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher, Apple iTunes, of course. Click the subscribe button and you will never miss an episode. You're going to love it. The Football Sunday podcast premiering Monday morning, December 16th. Subscribe today. Bill Curry is joining us here on Sports Spectrum, and he returns to the Sports Spectrum podcast. 3-time NFL champion, of course, a former coach both in the NFL as an assistant and in college, where he was the head coach at Alabama, a 2-time SEC Coach of the Year and the Bobby Dodd Coach of the Year winner in 1989. Bill played in 3 Super Bowls. The first one, Super Bowl I. He played in Super Bowl III and lost that one as a member of the Colts against the Jets. That was the Joe Namath game. And he played in Super Bowl V with the Colts and won the Super Bowl. So he's a 2-time Super Bowl champion, going way back to the early days of when the NFL first invented the Super Bowl game. And Bill Curry is, let's just say, he's one of the wisest people I've ever talked to, I've ever heard. I worked with Bill briefly on a few different things at ESPN, and then certainly when he was on Mike and Mike in the Morning, when I worked on that show, I just stopped and I would listen to 10, 15 minutes of Bill Curry just spitting out wisdom like it was nobody's business. And he's, like I said, one of the wisest people I've ever heard. We had him on the podcast back in January of 2018. That was episode number 70. And that was a great episode. You should go back and listen to it after you listen to this one, because that kind of takes him through the journey of his faith, through the journey of his football career, kind of chronological order on a lot of different things that took place in Bill's life. This podcast was one where I first of all, I invited him back and he said yes, which was great. But I really just wanted to touch on a bunch of different topics with him. And the big central topic here, of course, with Jesus at the center, was leadership. So I'm recommending, as you listen to this, maybe, mark this as one of your favorites and go back and listen to it a second and third time, because you're going to want a pen, you're going to want some paper, you're going to want a notebook, or maybe just go on your notes section on your phone and listen a few times, because he is full of wisdom. He gives 6 characteristics of a great leader. He talks about the 2 pains in life. He talks about loving your enemies. He talks about moral courage, which you'll hear about in a book that he's reading right now. He's got such great wisdom. You're going to love him. I'm going to shut up now. Take a listen to Bill Curry, returning here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And we are pleased to welcome back to Sports Spectrum one of my favorite people and one of the wisest men that I've ever heard don the airwaves at all the different places that he's spoken, and just really grateful to have him as a friend and have him as a guest here on Sports Spectrum. Welcome back, Bill Curry, to the podcast. Bill, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Jason. I was trying to figure out who you were talking about.
I'm talking about you, my friend. No,
thank you. Those are wonderful compliments. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's an honor. I mean, we had you on the podcast just about 2 years ago. One of my favorite interviews that we've done, and we talked a lot about your journey in that pod. You know, I was thinking too about podcasts. Do you listen to podcasts? Is that something that you kind of partake in?
I really haven't been listening unless there's some compelling reason. I mean, a friend is on, or there's a subject that I'm particularly interested in. Then I do listen. But I don't listen to sports podcasts. Not because they're beneath me somehow, but
sure. I
feel like I've only got a few years left to read. I'm going to try to read as many great books and as much of the Bible as I can, and so I do that a lot.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, you just turned 77 a few weeks ago, and obviously happy birthday, and 77 years young, as they say. How important is that? Because you just kind of alluded to that, to continue to learn and grow, even, in the, say, fourth quarter of your life.
My wife describes it. My wife, Carolyn, describes it as the fourth quarter. I describe it as the 2-minute drill.
That's right. With no timeouts, and you got to go 90 yards, right?
We got to go 90. We got to have a touchdown. We can't be kicking a field goal here.
That's right.
But I think what's important to each human being is what's in your heart. And I have these pipe dreams, things I've thought I would do, like take up my baritone horn again and go take lessons and just really get good and try to play in a brass quartet or something. But I haven't had the courage to go do it, so it must not be as important to me. Reading has become really a wonderful pastime. I live with a PhD who's an avid reader and she refers me to books. Our daughter is an English teacher, so I'm blessed to have a lot of good literature sort of handed to me, and also they check to see if I'm reading it. So that's an incentive, but I think it's up to what makes you, what resonates with your soul and your spirit at this age, because you do probably have free time if you're like most of us.
What are some of the books, or maybe a book that you've read recently that's really resonated with you?
Well, there are two books that have meant a great deal to me over the last decade, and I've read and reread them. One of them is just a small version of a very powerful message, and it's called Always We Begin Again. And it's done by John McQuiston II. John McQuiston is an attorney who took the principles, the rules of St. Benedict from, 1,500 years ago, and refined them into modern language, into modern terminology, and into modern thought. And not surprisingly, when he did the science, he found that everything that monks and nuns do or have done are good for your soul and good for your brain and good for your health. Things like prayer, meditation, quiet, calm, literally affects your heart rate. All those things do. And then there's a book called Moral Courage by Rushworth Kidder. I had the privilege of meeting him about 10 or 11 years ago, and he and his organization, the Institute for Global Ethics, have gone worldwide and interviewed and taken surveys of every single culture on earth, every single socio-economic, religious, political unit on earth. And they have done a statistical analysis, and they've found the values that everybody agrees upon. And so I try to teach those. There are 5 of them: honesty, fairness, respect, responsibility, compassion. And he was most effective when he would say, he'd look up at the audience, he'd say, now this is what every mama wants for her baby. And when those 5 values are present, then there's a 6th overriding culture, and it's called trust. And it's what we've completely gone away from in our country, and it's what we desperately need to come back to. So I'm rereading that book for about the fifth time. And always we begin again refers to the fact that we always quit when we start doing regular meditations. We have to start over. McQuiston was wise with that. So those are sort of consistent books. And then the Beatitudes are very powerful to me.
Yeah.
They were given to me at a particularly stressful time of life, and then certain passages of Scripture and things like that. And then I like to read fiction. I like to read things that are fun to read.
Yeah,
and there's a bunch of those.
Good storytelling. You mentioned the Beatitudes at a particularly stressful time. Can you share that story? What transpired that the Beatitudes were sort of introduced to you in your life?
Well, what happened is that I was under an enormous amount of pressure in a new job, and that was not unusual for me. I never could keep a job very long. But I had learned from Homer Rice at Georgia Tech that if you're not willing to spend 30 minutes a day in your spiritual life, then you can forget about ever being tranquil or having any peace of mind at any time in life. And he's dead right about that. And I fought him on it for a while. But anyhow, I was sitting down and spending my 30 minutes, and I began to get this message. Somebody sent me a set of audio tapes of the Beatitudes. And so I started listening to them driving to work. And I'd get to work, and then I'd open to the 5th chapter of Matthew, and I would read them. And they always calmed me down. And so for selfish reasons, I read them for a while, and then I put them up, and I started to get a very clear signal. And however God speaks to us, he was saying to me, you're going to learn these. And I said to him, no, I don't think so. I got to work on short yardage and 2-minute drill, and I'm busy here. Yeah. Well, there was no contest. Before long, I knew them. And they have just dominated my life in the most positive way and in the most surprising way. I had no intention of doing that, but it helped me through a dark hour and many hours since then.
You mentioned dark hours, and I often say to my daughter and to many people actually now when I share about adversity that it's really life's greatest teacher. Can you share a little bit about in your journey? Adversity. You talked about that moment with the Beatitudes, but you've obviously been through tons of adversity, both as a human, because that's just the way it works in life, but also as a coach and being around sports and as a player too. What adversity really is in terms of being a great teacher can show all of us as we go about our lives?
Adversity gives you an opportunity to learn, but it doesn't mean that it's automatic. Adversity usually either destroys us or it causes us to respond in a courageous way and to ask for God to help us. And when we do that, God never lets us down. It's just the answers aren't the ones we wish they were a lot of times.
Yeah.
For me, I can think of hundreds of examples of something that appeared to be adversity and ended up being a very positive thing, because the essence of the lesson of adversity from the beginning to the end of whatever it is don't quit. Just don't quit. Don't get discouraged and stay discouraged. Just stay with your basic values and beliefs, and you will come through. And very, very often at the other end, there is some wonderful outcome that you couldn't have imagined. A sort of a petty example with me was the fact that I never wanted to play football. I didn't like football. I didn't even watch football. But I sort of got shoved out there in the 8th grade, and then they stuck me at the position that nobody in the world wanted to play, offensive center. And I remember thinking, why would I, if I could, I wanted to pitch for the Yankees. If I can stand 60 feet 6 inches from you and throw something at you, why would I want to run into you and risk injuring my little puffy body? But that's the way I was 12 years old. That's how I thought. I was lazy. And I thought I would quit, but then I had a problem because my father lived at our house, and you didn't quit anything at our house. He was a Presbyterian Sunday school teacher and an infantry officer. He said, I didn't make you go out there, but you're not going to leave your friends and your teammates. You're going to stick it out. So there I was, stuck in the worst position in the worst sport that I didn't even want to play. I had to learn to hike the ball. And it was only a few years that I was hiking the ball to Billy Lothridge at Georgia Tech. And a few more years I was hiking the ball to Roger Staubach and then Bart Starr and then John Unitas. And it turned out to be the only position in all of sport that would have allowed me to have a career. What I could not see at age 12 became a great privilege of being in the huddle and in the presence of, and to have the responsibility for protecting the greatest leaders in the history of our sport up until the time I played. So that's just one small example, and there are many more, but that's the one that people resonate with because they recognize those names.
Yeah, no, and it's a perfect example of adversity, shaping us and not breaking us, I guess, in a lot of ways. And I remember having Coach Tony Dungy on the podcast, maybe earlier this year, back in January or so. And I remember asking him, because we see a lot of coaches and leaders trying to lead through intimidation or yelling or screaming, cussing guys out. And, I know you now. I didn't know you when you coached, but you're one of those sort of gentle giants. You're one of those very quiet, gentle leaders, in my opinion. Tony Dungy, very much a similar type of person, but he thought a humble, quieter type leader like himself could still work in coaching football today. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that type of coach can still work in this, world of football that we live in where it seems like everybody's screaming and yelling?
Anybody that knows what he or she is doing can work in today's world, because what this generation can do is they can spot a phony in a heartbeat. If you're out there jumping up and down, yelling and screaming because you think you're the next Vince Lombardi, they'll turn you off. They'll laugh at you behind your back. If you're out there trying to be Tony Dungy and be meek and mild and gentle, and that's not your personality, they won't respond to that either. But what they respond to is authenticity. And when you are yourself, whatever that is, and I had my moments when I yelled and screamed, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes I was dead wrong doing it. But most of the time, that's not my personality. So that's what you and others saw. But my players, the ones that thrill me the most, and of all the serendipities of life, of all of God's gifts, next to my faith and my family, the one I'm most surprised at and enjoy the most is I hear from my former players almost every day, and there are thousands of them, and they remember what was said with utter conviction. And I might have been yelling with that day, and I might have been quiet that day. But they remember because we all believed in it. We believed in it before we said it. And then, of course, there are plenty, too, where I did not do so well, and I missed my opportunity. I have a chance maybe to make up sometimes with the ones where I made mistakes. But I think what players respond to is being real, and they know who's who.
So with that in mind, what do you think makes a great leader? What do you think is the key characteristics of someone who is a great leader? Because I'm actually finishing up a book on leadership, and a lot of who I talk about in the book that I'm writing from the time that I spent at ESPN are people who weren't in leadership positions from a title perspective. They weren't the manager or the vice president or the person in charge or the person on air, like our friends Mike and Mike or somebody like that. They were the people behind the scenes. They were the people at the cash register. They were the people cleaning up after everybody else was done. So I'm curious for you, what do you think makes a great leader?
Through all the years of being exposed to so many great leaders, if you define great by number of victories and by being inspirational in their presence, and that's the way we defined it. I think it's far more important now for them to have been inspirational, but they were. And I've evolved 6 characteristics. I didn't read this in a book somewhere, and I wasn't taught this by a coach. this came through trial and error. And the 6 things that I noticed about the great leaders, the champions that I was with, and some of them were football people and some of them weren't, and some of them were scholars, but they had 6 fairly consistent common characteristics. And number 1, they show up.
Yep.
By that, of course, that sounds so obvious. Well, of course they show up, Curry. No, I mean, they show up on time. And when I think of the great champions that I played with or played for, I can't remember any of them ever being late for anything. I was late sometime. Certainly was not always the champion. They were never late. I can't remember a time when Willie Davis was late. I can't remember ever John Mackey being late or Bart Starr. So they show up on time, and they show up ready to go. They are vibrating energy. They don't have to say a word. They walk in the locker room changes because we all carry a certain aura about us. And the same is true of a negative person. So that negative person walks in the locker room and the aura changes to one of negativity and downcast glances and that sort of thing. So everybody has that. The great champions showed up, and they showed up ready. Second characteristic that they all seem to share is singleness of purpose. And Vince Lombardi at that was the best. And he was not a perfect human being, certainly had his flaws, but there was never... He found 1,000 ways to make us understand what our purpose was for being in that room. And there was only one purpose in that case, and it was to win every single battle in your game against your man and to win every single game. If you didn't win, you pick yourself up and you get ready to go again. So that singleness of purpose was crucial. The third characteristic was surprising, and it was unselfishness. When I reported to the Green Bay Packers, my biggest problem was that I'd never been in a huddle with an African-American person. Well, Vince Lombardi's greatest asset was that he never allowed racism. He would not allow prejudice of any kind. He didn't care what color your skin was. He cared a lot if you were a good human being and if you could play football. Well, that wasn't true all over the NFL. Nor is it today. But everybody on that team knew that he was respected, regardless of where he came from or what he looked like. So I figured the African-American guys would injure me and send me home. It was 1965. I was from College Park, Georgia. I was a white boy with a Southern accent. They embraced me. They loved me, especially Willie Davis. Taught me how to act, taught me how to talk, taught me how to play football and practice. If I live to be 1,000, I'll never be able to pay those guys back, especially Willie and Coach Lombardi. The fourth characteristic is not going to surprise you, and the champions are tough. Yeah. And by tough, I'm not talking about trash talk. I'm not talking about kicking somebody when they're down. I'm not talking about calling somebody a name. I'm talking about taking responsibility. Responsibility for your performance, responsibility for your team's performance. The people who refuse to take responsibility, who call other people names, are scared. And we know they're scared, and we can't wait to play against them. The champions don't do any of those. Champions are tough in that they take responsibility. And oh, by the way, it's a privilege to line up next to them on the goal line because they're tough in the tough going as well, obviously. And the fifth thing is the champions are prepared. I remember practicing 5 hours under Don Shula and leaving the practice field thinking, gosh, I don't know if I can make it to the shower. And I take my shower and I come back out and I look down on the practice field and there are 2 guys still practicing pass routes, throwing, catching. I'll let you guess who they were. Johnny Unitas and Raymond Berry.
Yeah.
That is how you get in the Hall of Fame, not by being talented. So they were so ready. They were willing to do the things at practice that the opponents were not willing to do. And that year, my first year with the Colts, Unitas was the most valuable player in the NFL for the 3rd time. And it wasn't because he had more talent. So it's that kind of preparation. And finally, the most important one is that champions just never quit. You can't make them quit. You can beat them half to death. They will not quit. They will not let you down. And we all know it when we're there in the 2-minute drill. And that's why there are certain teams that are just almost impossible to beat. And I had the privilege to be on some of them. So those are some of the things.
No, that's great. And I hope people listening are going to get a notebook and a pen and a piece of paper out, because that's wonderful pearls of wisdom that you just shared. And I think that kind of stems over to disciplines, because I wanted to ask you about the disciplines and practices, as a player, as a coach. You just mentioned some of them that make the great champions. Those are all disciplines in a lot of way, especially preparation, and having that singleness of purpose. There's a discipline in that. But I wonder for you, those daily disciplines and practices that you had as a coach, as a player, how do they transfer over to you in your relationship with the Lord, and kind of those daily disciplines that you talk about?
Well, they transfer perfectly because God requires discipline. And I learned this about halfway through my coaching career. Willie Davis taught it to me really when I was a rookie with the Packers, but I couldn't articulate it until later. I saw it written, and it is this fact. There are two pains in life: the pain of discipline, the pain of regret. You choose. A guy named Jim Rohn coined that phrase, ROHN, and I was running around spouting it because I didn't know he had said it until somebody came up and told me. But Willie Davis told me my rookie year, don't leave regrets on our practice field, and you might make the team. And it made all the difference to me. So the discipline thing that you choose, the pain of discipline is usually brief. You have to do extra work, or you have to turn down a pleasure, or you decide not to drink a certain beverage, or to smoke a funny looking cigarette, or whatever it is that you're turning down, or to condition extra hard, or to read the scriptures extra long. Well, it usually doesn't last very long, but you walk away, you be dishonest, and you destroy somebody's life by calling them a terrible name. Yeah. You ruin somebody by trashing them in public when you're in a position of power. That regret lasts the rest of your life.
Bill, I want to pivot a little bit because I know that you're passionate about this, and I love following you on Twitter, which is a really unique place to kind of get some thoughts in a lot of places for you. I love that you're on there. You alluded to it earlier, in a very, very divided society right now, and whether if you disagree with me, or think differently, or look differently, or believe differently, then you're my enemy. And I think it's so terrible, even going back to what you said about Coach Lombardi, not tolerating that in the locker room. What are your thoughts on where we are today as a society? You've been around a long time. You mentioned that 2-minute drill and that season of life you're in the fourth quarter. But as believers in Christ, how can we be more united and not divided?
Oh, by loving our enemies. I mean, it's... Does that sound familiar to you?
Sounds biblical.
If you love those who love you, what is so extraordinary about that? Love those who hate you, who despitefully use you, who say all manner of evil against you in my name's sake. Those are our marching orders, and they're simple, but they're not easy, but they're very clear. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. They shall inherit the earth. Well, my challenge is, instead of jumping up and trashing somebody verbally, which I have done way too many times, my responsibility is to love them and pray for them, especially if we disagree. We took a trip to South Africa this year with our daughter and her 2 daughters and her husband. It was just absolutely wonderful. We walk in a very famous church in Cape Town, and there's a mirror. And you walk up, and it's a full-length mirror. And being an egotistical, beat-up old coach, I got to go look at myself. And I got nailed. I mean, it was a perfect setup. God just walked me over to. On the top, it says, "You are beautiful." And I thought, well, that's nice. And I looked down, and at the bottom it says, "And so is your enemy." Those are our orders. If we do what Christ ordered us to do, then a lot of the problems would be solved. And I'm talking about those of us that try to face reality.
Do you think it's different today than it was in the 50s and 60s, or is it just more compounded because of the world that we live in, the digital social media world that we live in?
Well, there are more ways for people to pose as experts without having to give anybody their name or without having to face somebody. I think it's a point of honor. If you do have a difference with somebody, you go look them in the eye, you tell them the truth, and you treat them with respect. If you can't look someone in the eye, and especially I'm talking about things when you're the leader now, you got to fire somebody because something's happened that's just inexcusable, and you're not able to keep this person. You have to look them in the eye and tell them the truth and give them a chance to redeem themselves, if not by keeping their job, at least by keeping their dignity. And so little things like that, I think God expects us to do those things. And it's very clear from the scripture, and you can quote verse after verse after verse in all these areas. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have read it enough that I do know what the deal is, and I'm horrified at my imperfections, and I beg him to help me with them.
Last couple questions here with Bill Curry on the podcast. I want to end with, if you could, story time with Bill, if you want to call it that. I know that you've told tons of stories over the years, especially on your different interviews that you've been on. You're one of my favorite storytellers. And obviously it was sad earlier this year to see the passing of your friend, former teammate. You alluded to him earlier, Bart Starr, the legendary Hall of Famer. I had the opportunity to talk with Bart briefly during an interview I helped set up at ESPN many years ago, and he was the nicest, kindest, most humble, gentle person you would expect, even in just the few minutes that I talked to him. I'm wondering if you could share maybe your favorite Bart Starr story, and maybe one that's, I don't know, not a lot of people know about or have heard about.
I've got so many.
Yeah.
First of all, what you experienced with him, that's how he was every single day of his life. That's how he was. I didn't answer your question a moment ago. Have things changed since the 50s? They have changed in the volume of trash that is spewed. I know we both know that, and we both participate and try to be a positive part of that reality.
Yeah.
But here's Bart Starr in a nutshell. He and Zeke Bratkowski and I are sitting in his home. It's a Sunday afternoon in Green Bay. It's raining. We're working on the offense. I was the offensive line coach for Bart and the Packers. Zeke was the quarterback coach, and we weren't doing very well on offense, and I'm not sure why we were at his house, but probably to escape all the intrusions.
Yeah.
So while we're working on the offense, there's a knock at the door, and Bart's wife, Cherry, goes to the door and a very halting voice says, "Mrs. Starr, I am so embarrassed to be doing this, but my father doesn't have long to live. He worships your husband. Do you think Coach Starr could sign this paper?" Zeke and I are looking at each other now. We're rolling our eyes. Oh, my gosh, this guy's got the audacity to go up to Bart Starr's. Bart says, "Who is it?" And Cherry says, "Well, it's a gentleman for you." And Bart said to us, "Wait right here." He walks to the door. The guy now, he's just terrified. He says, "Coach, I shouldn't be here. I'm going to leave. I don't want to bother you." Bart said, Whoa. Now tell me about your father." He said, "Well, he's got a terminal disease, and he's just loved you with all his heart." Bart said, "Where is he?" And the guy said, "No, just please sign this paper." He was trying to get away. He was just trying to escape this awful situation. He said, "He's out in the car." Bart said, "Go get him."
Wow.
He said, "I couldn't do that." He said, "Yeah, you're going to." He goes and gets the old man. The man walks in. He's sobbing. So Bart takes him, puts his arm around him, and walks him through the house, shows him every Super Bowl ring, all the honors, all the Citizen of the Year, all the things that we would all love to celebrate with someone that we worship like that. And he walks him back to the door, signs an autographed picture for him. And the gentleman got himself under control. And he said, "Coach Starr, I'm prepared to die. You have completed my life." He walks out. Cherry shuts the door. Bart walks back over to Zeke and me and says, "Okay, where were we?"
Just went right back to it.
Like nothing.
Wow.
I mean, that's because that's who he was.
It was just
that's how he lived. And I wrote in a book, I wrote a chapter about him, and I said, I started thinking that maybe I thought too much of Bart and that nobody could be this great. And by the time I finished the chapter, I said, well, you know what? I think, I was wrong. He is this great.
Wow. That's such a great story.
You're not supposed to worship other people. You're just not supposed to. And of course, he had flaws, but I swear I couldn't find one.
I love it. I'm so glad that you shared that. Thank you so much for that. As we close, and I really do appreciate all your time. You're wonderful to Sports Spectrum and certainly been a great friend to me. What are you learning from Jesus today? I asked that question to all of our guests on the end of our shows here. But for you, we asked it a couple years ago, and I'm wondering where he has you right now. What are you learning from the Lord today?
That my enemy is beautiful, and that I'm to pray for the people that I detest, pray for them earnestly, sincerely, not some prayer like, Lord, make him change. No, the way I want him to be? No. He said, that's not the deal, Bill. Pray for him with all your heart, for his soul, for his eternal salvation, and love him just like he is, because that's how I love you. That's the hardest lesson for me.
My enemy is beautiful. That's a wonderful quote, my friend. Thank you so much for your time, Bill. Really appreciate it, and wish you nothing but the best. Hopefully our paths will cross again very soon.
Well, I hope so too, Jason. You're doing great work, and you just keep on keeping on.
That was Bill Curry, and like I said, you might want to go back and listen 2 or 3 times to this one because there's lots of great nuggets and lots of great wisdom that came out of the mouth of Bill Curry, and I just appreciate him for being here on the podcast. What a great guy. I mean, so many wonderful stories, a heart of gold, just wants to help, wants to serve, and grateful to have him on the podcast, and like I said, grateful to have him as a friend. Give him a follow on Twitter. Coach Bill Curry is his Twitter handle, Coach Bill Curry. And you can tell that he's very selective and wise in what he posts. Also want to recommend you go back and listen to episode 70 of the podcast from January 11th, 2018. That was our first interview with Bill Curry, and you can hear his full Christian testimony in that interview. And he talks a lot about just how he came to be a believer and what that looks like to live out that faith. He shared a great Vince Lombardi story in that podcast and really how his faith has helped him overcome adversity into his coaching career as well. Storytelling gold. That's what Bill Curry is. He is such a great storyteller. Episode 70, the first time we had him on, and this episode was the second time. And hopefully we'll get him on a third time because I could have asked him questions all day long. Thanks to Bill Curry for being here on Sports Spectrum. Also want to thank our sponsors, our partners, Compassion International, for being a part of all that we do here at Sports Spectrum. And what they do is, and they've been doing it for a very long time, we're talking about 66 years of experience releasing children from poverty. And they've found that the most effective way to do that, caring for children, is through the local church. That's why they partner with more than 7,000 local churches in 25 countries, delivering God's love and care to children in need. They do it one child at a time. And more than 2 million children today are breaking the cycle of poverty for good because of Compassion International. Check out the website, compassion.com/sports spectrum, compassion.com/sports spectrum, and pray about sponsoring a child today. As always, we appreciate you checking out our podcast, clicking that subscribe button. If this is the first time you ever heard of Sports Spectrum, welcome. It's so great to have you here. Like I said, click that subscribe button so you never miss an episode of Sports Spectrum's podcast. And then go to our website, sportspectrum.com. That's a great place to get all of our content, including a daily devotional at 6 a.m. Each and every podcast we've ever done is right there on the website as well. And then articles all day long on the intersection of sports and faith. Also want to encourage you to subscribe to our magazine. You can do that right at the website. It's $18 for an entire year. Makes a great Christmas gift. $18 for an entire year, 4 issues, 4 quarterly issues, gets you the Sports Spectrum magazine, which has been growing strong for 30 plus years and really is just awesome. It's a great magazine. It's so well done. The design, Aaron does such a great job with that. The layout, John does such a great job with that. I love working with Aaron and John, and they put their heart and soul into these magazines. And it will be awesome to have you kind of help our ministry a little bit. But again, it's $18, super cheap, 4 issues, get you the Sports Spectrum magazine. Subscribe today over at sportspectrum.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time with a brand new episode here on Sports Spectrum's podcast. Have a great rest of your day.